What we consider journalism today started under the Roman Empire with the Acta Diurna, which was a government-controlled document that publicized the government's new policies and events. In the 19th century, journalism evolved into a commercial endeavor. A century later, universities began offering journalism degrees, allowing the journalism industry to provide a more legitimate career that more people could pursue. Nowadays, we have things such as the internet, social media, where all the individuals may create their own stories, share their own opinions, and broadcast their own voices. The barrier of entry to journalism is becoming easier and easier to overcome. Just a phone and a story is all you basically need. Is it necessarily professional? No. That has become more of an issue in this new digital age. We're starting to forget what's professional and what is amateur reporting. In addition, many nations suppress the few professional journalists who exist in order to control the information, with the most suppressive states located in the Far East. Well, maybe the second most suppressive. I point towards the nation officially flying the flag with the 5 yellow stars that once followed the sickle and hammer, China, or more specifically, the CCP. The beginnings of the nation were torn with war and division, but today it's a global powerhouse of commerce and contention. Since the start of the People's Republic of China, or the PRC, they made the press a tool under the state, meaning there was never private ownership of the press. Why is that? Well, it's in order to follow through with their socialist ideologies. But how exactly does the CCP promote their own voices across the world, and why exactly? First of all, the why might be easier to tackle. Throughout history, the CCP had slowly pulled away from the extreme side of socialism, communism, and adopted a not-so-extreme type of socialist policy. And that's partly the reason why they pulled out of the Soviet Union. In fact, China has turned into a market-based economy whilst maintaining some governmental control over the economy. So they're socialist, just slightly more capitalistic than when founding members of the PRC imagined China to be. But now, President Xi Jinping has gradually taken the PRC back into a more communistic direction. What are the CCP's goals, and what do they exactly get out of controlling the press? For all we know, it could just be pandas are the world's treasure, and we as citizens of the world must adore the pandas more, or something like that. So here's an excerpt from the bossman himself, Xi Jinping. I couldn't find any videos about the speech, so I'm just going to read out what's on the transcript.
高举旗帜，引领导向，围绕中心，服务大局，团结人民，鼓舞士气，乘风化人，凝心聚力，澄清妙误，明辨是非，连接中外，沟通世界。
This was a conference where Xi Jinping specifically set the goals of the PRC to the media industry throughout China, which translated into raise high the banner of Marxism, Leninism, direct proper guidance of public opinion, focus on the control tasks of the party, unite the people, encourage high morale, spread public morals, create cohesion, clear up any fallacies, distinguish between truth and falsehood, join the CCP and the outside, connect the world. It sounds pretty patriotic and uplifting, right? Well, reading between the lines, there's a more sinister undertone. He's trying to promote socialism not just within China, but abroad, get people to acknowledge China's views and change their opinions to align with China's. In addition, he wants to cover up any false information, hopefully encouraging foreigners to connect with China both economically and politically, and to marginalize, suppress, and demonize any criticizers of the CCP. And as a side note, the CCP also wants to try promoting nationalistic sentiments and try to reunite with Taiwan. Part 3. How the CCP promotes its narrative and content throughout the world. Quote from Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. If you showed a driver a green blur, oh yes, he'd say, that's grass. A pink blur, that's a rose garden. White blurs are houses, brown blurs are cows. Now, the messaging of how I read aloud might change what you got from the quote, but the bottom line is society usually looks at things at face value. We really do explore things deeply without a motivating interest in a subject, which is one of the things the CCP takes advantage of. In many states abroad, they use several tactics that are practiced both by other nations throughout the world and some unique tactics developed by the CCP to promote their view on the world. The first tactic they employ is the use of their own official state media and bringing them to the international audience. The most obvious and essentially the microphone for the CCP is People's Daily. It's the official paper of the CCP and it contains reports of policies and its viewpoints on various issues. Other notable newspapers that aren't directly run by the CCP include China Global Television Network, China Central Television, China Daily, Xinhua, and China News Service, among other notable presses. Most, if not all, the presses are available in multiple countries and in multiple languages like English, Spanish, French, Russian, and Arabic on top of Mandarin via the internet, satellite, and cable. These languages allow for the CCP's ideologies and viewpoints to be shown to the world, even if the people don't know it's from China. Actually, over the years, they have continued to pour more money into these international presses than in years prior. And for an example, we looked into the USA branch of China Daily. Under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, any foreign companies companies are required to file a report on approximately the amount of money the company is spending. And in 2009, China Daily was reported to have budgeted a little over $600,000 in expenses, but by 2019, approximately 10 years later, the expenses climbed all the way up to $5 million in expenses. That's a tenfold increase. That signifies a stronger demand for foreign presses. Not only do these CCP presses have their own international presence throughout the traditional media like broadcast or print, but they also have a social media presence, which is also blocked in the CCP. It also includes Douyin, which is a separate entity to TikTok throughout the world. On the platform formerly known as Twitter, now named simply X, People's Daily CCP has a follower count of 6.6 million, and CGTN has almost double the count with 13 million followers as of October 17, 2023. They usually issue stories containing positive messages of the Belt and Road Initiative, a continental trade network that goes from China to Europe, Southeast Asia, and East Africa, breaking news and content that promotes CCP in a positive light. And those numbers are mainly real people, right? So that brings up the first question. Are there fake followers to boost the follower count? There are. However, Facebook has reported to The Economist that only a small percentage of the followers of Chinese state media is actually fake, and most were genuine people following these accounts. Second, is there a bit of deception at play when the CCP brands itself? For example, CCP's People's Daily brands itself as simply the largest newspaper in China and does not identify itself as the official paper of the state. Third, the CCP is advertising to recruit more followers. These sites regularly run ads that feature pandas, the Great Wall, or other interesting modern subjects like how fast bullet trains are. Though these ads can be flagged by the social media accounts as political messages, and interestingly, they regularly run in developing countries like Latin America or Southeast Asia rather than developed countries such as the US. Fourth, more aggressive and negative content in the Chinese media has been appearing throughout the past years, like CGTN's Twitter account liking posts about how the protesters in the Hong Kong 2019 protests were described as terrorists. Fifth, they employ the use of officials like Chinese diplomats to promote their messages. For example, Chinese ambassadors to Argentina have 14 op-eds, 10 interviews to the press, and even visited the Argentinian newsrooms 8 times throughout 2015. These interviews, op-eds, and visits weren't really for giggles. They brought the CCP's messages to the news, and even in some cases were friendly relations with top media officials would press stories for more pro-Beijing sentiment. But this wasn't entirely off the table. This is standard practice for diplomats across the world. So this method is free real estate, right? Well, there's more to it than that. There's a particular tactic that the CCP uses, and it's called 借船出海, or translate into borrowing the boat to go out to sea. Basically, they would use advertisements to encourage the press to write their own pro-China articles. For example, the New York Times and Wall Street Journal has a section in their newspapers under the name China Watch, which covers stories about China, but this is sponsored by the CCP media outlets. So what you have here is essentially a blur between what is advertising and what is news. People may not know if what they're reading is actually from the CCP. In addition to news-like advertisements, some companies would provide news content, including text, video, and photos for partner media companies, especially when it came to Xinhua and China News Service for free. On the surface, it may seem like independent publications, but below the surface, it's CCP's wired content. Some countries like Thailand would have exclusive deals with China to have rights to broadcast Chinese news, which in Thailand's case is TNN News. However, it doesn't stop there. It's particularly a big issue in the US as well as in many Western nations, and that's the power of capitalism. In the 2020 Olympics, Dafenghao, a news outlet that has repeatedly been identified to spread fake news, claimed that Taiwanese independence would try and bid to change its name from Chinese Taipei to a different name. The name that it has right now is okay with China, but if they were to change the name, they could get a lot of backlash from mainland China. This divided the country's politics and people. In addition, on Twitter and other social media sites, they could have Chinese trolls spreading fake news, further inciting fear and mistrust toward the Taiwanese government. Part 4. Short parts on censorship. Censorship is ironically controversial. People want to stop the flow of information by censoring information. The information can never be seen again, well, legally. Let's try and remember the Chinese diplomats. Outside China, the diplomats would try and intimidate journalists through either public shaming or phone calls. For example, in March of 2019, a liberal Russian newspaper reporter from, this is me trying to pronounce this, Nezavisimaya Gazeta was emailed a warning from the Moscow embassy overseas press secretary, saying, "I'll tell you categorically that you need to delete this article immediately from your newspaper's website. Otherwise, you will be blacklisted and you will never be allowed to enter China." That's a threat to someone's career right there. Domestically, though, they would obstruct foreign correspondence by delaying or outright denying visa renewals, seemingly blocking arbitrarily and detain family members of the journalists. It might seem unrighteous, but it helps China form a boundary around itself to protect from critics abroad. Threats to foreign media outlets or owners in general is another tactic they employ. Similar to how diplomats would send threatening letters to journalists, a state entity would send a message resulting in foreign media outlets for self-censorship. South China Morning Post, for example, was bought by co-founder of Alibaba and CCP member Jack Ma. The South China Morning Post repeatedly posts stories about the greatness of China. In Africa, Chinese investments into independent news companies abroad have dramatically expanded due in part with the going out policy. As the name implies, the CCP goes out of the country and specifically targets African media companies, usually with high percentages of stake holdings. As a shareholder, the CCP can demand what can or can't be written into the press, or else the media company would go bankrupt. You see the problem in that? If the CCP wants to change information to suit their needs, then this story could potentially be false, or be spreading disparate information, or in some cases, there might not even be a story.
The story would just be a paper ball thrown at the trash at that point.
Seems unfair, but you have to do what the boss says or you'll be unemployed and be living on the streets. This is a little underhanded, but it serves its country needs of quashing any critics.
Next, back on the online sphere, we have cyber attacks, physical assaults, and online verbal abuse. Reportedly, more Chinese internet trolls have become more active among the Chinese diaspora communities, like political YouTuber Chen Paokong. His comments are riddled with people calling him traitor or criticizing his physique. And in Hong Kong, there have been reports of physical assaults. While Apple Daily was still operating in Hong Kong, a reporter was dining and thugs were reported to assault her. And in Epoch Times, still in Hong Kong, they had some cases of arson committed. As you can probably tell, propaganda and censorship is very similar. Some may say it's even two sides of the same coin. By censoring the press, they also help by reducing the negativity and bring more propaganda or good positivity to the press about the CCP and a threat to democracy. Yet, this isn't the last thing that China has of its toolshed. Part 5. The control of content delivery systems outside the CCP. It's not only what and how they're spreading using the websites and presses and sometimes trolls. Just take out your phone. Go on. Now, where are they made from? Most likely they're from China due to their cheap labor, although it is becoming more expensive. Those phones could be tracking your every move in every conversation, even without you knowing, and reporting it back to China. Along with the advent of sites like TikTok, on top of overall media consumption on the rise in millennials and Generation Z's lack of attention, the CCP is seeping into markets all across the world. Remember the going out policy? To give some context, a lot of African families are largely poor and they don't have the luxury of having huge investments like most Western families do. So TV services such as the PBC's BBC World Service are usually out of the price range of African families, which is where Chinese state TV media steps in. They usually offer far better deals that are usually much more affordable compared to those Western TV services. Fortunately, it is exploitative, but it is partly Western nation's fault for having such high prices on TV in general. When we look at prices, we want something that's usually high quality and cheap. Chinese state media offers both. Some Africans might consciously know that their propaganda in those news broadcasters or their televisions, but sometimes to watch something is better than not having something to watch, right? But it's not just Africa. Cuba, Pakistan, Cambodia, Thailand, United Arab Emirates, and many other nations have signed similar TV infrastructure partnerships with the CCP, thus helping the CCP become a big player in the international TV industry. The world of information technology and the way we pass on information has drastically increased with the invention of books, the printing press, and especially relevant today is the online world. Specifically, we're connected today by social media platforms. Platforms where we're able to access personalized information condensed to a single app. They use this new invention to create their own apps, such as TikTok in China, it's called Douyin, and has become a huge culture in the young people. More central to East and Southeast Asia, WeChat is a huge everything app that even Elon Musk is trying to emulate with Twitter, or now known as X. TikTok has been contested for several years for its lack of transparency, but also its proven links with Chinese propaganda ads across Europe. In December of 2022, ByteDance, tech giant and owner of TikTok, admitted that it had used TikTok to survey reporters both in the UK and the US. Although TikTok CEO Zhou Shouji has reportedly denied that TikTok's data is kept in US soil during the hearing about whether or not TikTok should be banned in the US, and that is trying to build a firewall to fend off any foreign manipulation. As of October of 2023, TikTok is still actively used in the US. While WeChat is a much more Chinese intended audience, it is slowly garnering Chinese diaspora in some foreign use, particularly any diplomats linked to Chinese diaspora communities, with evidence of WeChat systematically monitoring texts and conversations about keywords such as Tibet, Xi Jinping, or the CCP. So WeChat is a much more monitored app compared to TikTok. In Australian Professor John Fitzgerald's words, we are entering uncharted territory. WeChat was not designed to work in democracy. Other foreign app companies such as Snapchat with parent company Snap and gaming giant Blizzard has been reported to have Chinese investments into the company. Notably with Blizzard that had condemned its gamers to supporting the 2019 Hong Kong pro-democracy protests. Okay, so we have all these software and apps that are all being manipulated, but what about the hardware? Surely there isn't anything wrong with our hardware, right? By now, you should know that China is in every nook and cranny of any industry. So Apple is one of the largest tech companies that sells products ranging from phones like the popular iPhone to laptops like the Mac, and these hardware are all produced. Chinese-made phones such as Huawei and Xiaomi have also been contested for its efficacy in protecting data from where the phones are made. Bottom line is that the CCP's influence over how content is being delivered is no telling how much information is controlled without some form of transparency. These unprofessional ways of delivering information is why journalism in general is getting harder to reach individual people that want the truth. Be careful of what apps, platforms, and even technology you use. It may take more than you paid for. Part 6. The impacts and results of the CCP. This section is more like a recap, but also a way for me to talk about some of the deep concerns about you, the audience, need to be more aware of. Just as a preference, don't think that the people of the country of China are bad people. Most of them are just being dragged along and have lives similar to us, eating, sleeping, going to get a degree, laughing, playing, and generally having the most humble lives a person can live. Although with more people are getting a little too cocky about spending. It's not the people's fault that few individuals in the CCP are trying to become more socialist. In fact, after Mao Zedong and before Xi Jinping, there were massive reforms toward a more capitalistic society, albeit still somewhat socialist. Particularly in the journalism industry, journalists are getting suppressed due to CCP's involvements, advertisements, stock investments, threats, and disinformation efforts in general. As politics gets more involved in the press, the more power the CCP will gain and the more the foreign audience will start to trust China. So really be careful of what you're consuming.
So I'm going to be talking about something a little bit more local, specifically an article from last month from the Fairbanks Daily Newsminer written by Jack Barnwell. It is titled Assembly Work Session Reviews Library Selection Process, and it covers the proceedings of an assembly meeting in which the collection services manager of the Borough Library gave a presentation on how the library selects books to be put on their shelves. This came after an assembly member, Tammy Wilson, raised concerns that some materials in the library were not age-appropriate, citing community feedback as well as personal concerns. The collection services manager, Laura Salisbury, explained that there are 13 librarians in charge of book selection, and that after the librarians select books, the library director evaluates the selections. She said that there are, quote, several layers to the process, including reviews, content of the material, what the critics say, any prizes the books have received, audience suitability, reading level, and more. She also went over what it would take to have a book removed from the shelves. She said you can submit a form to request removal of a book. Once received, the book is closely reviewed and researched by the librarians and the director. Then they hold a meeting where they will vote by secret ballot, meaning that they will not be able to see how the others are voting. This meeting is not open to the public. The person that submitted the request for removal will then be notified of the decision. According to Salisbury, this has happened only 17 times in the past 10 years. If the person is not satisfied with the decision made by the librarians, they can appeal to the Library Commission. If this happens, the meeting will be open to the public. If you are dissatisfied with the Library Commission's decision, it can be appealed to the Alaska Superior Court. The article also briefly mentioned current trends of book banning in America. Kristen Kelly, an assembly member, mentioned the concern that was brought up about a book. She cited the statistic that oftentimes book bans contain queer protagonists or people of color. She asked how the library will protect against this, quote, wave and protect young adults' freedom to choose books that they want to read. In response to this, Salisbury restated that while they take removal requests very seriously, each request will be very thoroughly reviewed and is subject to the entire process in order to be removed. The reporting on this story did seem very sound to me, and it seemed like it covered the voices on both sides quite well. However, I did notice that the author didn't state the name of the book that was of concern, even though it was mentioned that there was a specific book in question that was seen as inappropriate. I wondered why that was. One thing that I could speculate was that the author was trying to keep this under wraps a bit, and by preventing people from knowing the name of the book, he was trying to maybe prevent people from starting a book banning, quote, wave, as it was called, in Fairbanks, simply because they support the politician that wanted the book removed. In my personal opinion, that may have been a good judgment call on behalf of the reporter, if that is the reason why the book wasn't mentioned, but one could argue that he shouldn't have left out such a big detail like that in the reporting, especially because it is something somebody that uses the library often may want to be aware of, or if they like that book, or if they don't like that book. As far as the future for newspapers in America is concerned, the editor of the Boston Globe said it's hard to know. He said, the business model is definitely broken, but the journalism model is not, which basically translates to, we aren't making enough money, but people are definitely still interested in what we have to offer. According to data that I found from the Pew Research Center, advertising revenue from the newspaper industry was down 25% from 2019 to 2022. The percentage of this revenue being from digital advertising has steadily increased, however. This is good news for the potential for digital advertising, but it does mean that digital advertising doesn't make as much money as print advertising. Unfortunately, print readership is going down as well, as people now prefer to get their news online. The circulation of print newspapers is lower than it has ever been. It has decreased from over 62.3 million readers in 1990 to just over 24.2 million in 2020. That being said, online readership is estimated to have risen by 38% since online newspapers ever became a thing. Basically, the moral of the story is we just need to figure out how to monetize online readership, because that looks like that's where newspapers are going. Nowadays, the First Amendment has vast amounts of interpretations. This leads to many ways for groups to take advantage and exploit other speech. The recent movement of increasing book bans in the United States may be coming to Fairbanks, as Jack Barnwell reports in the Newsminer. At least the press is still free.
On the other hand, a more controlled and suppressive press is still worse than a free press, right? Well, a free press can lead to a lot more positives in the sense that controversial takes are being expressed and works for the democracy. But does that work for a socialist government? Not really. If you're in the shoes of the socialists, it can be hard to balance the wants of the common people with expression of discontent. The more discontent there is, generally the less a socialist government would work. Is that right? Is it wrong? That's the main issue in journalism within any government.
Which brings up the issue between capitalism and socialism. There's a problem for each system to resolve these issues with. Particularly for journalism, a more capitalistic mindset can skew how a journalist can write in favor of the pay. And it's unrealistic to say that an article can have unbiased news. That's ideological, not realistic. We censor ourselves for the benefit of others. While socialist reporting works for the state, money isn't a huge factor in reporting. Everyone wants to get along, right? Those two systems both can suppress true reporting. One can be more oppressive than the other, but it's still a problem in both systems.
In my opinion, the CCP methods of promoting themselves and getting their shoes into every facet of the world is definitely not legally and morally wrong. So, should we say no to the CCP? To a certain extent. It's really interesting to see how the structure of a government under which reporting is done can have such a precedenting effect on the function of something like a simple news story. The CCP would never run a news story that would paint censorship in a bad light, while here in America, freedom of speech in the press is practically everything we stand for. So the lead of the story is just take everything with a grain of salt.
The thing is, a free press and freedom to choose the media you consume, in the case of the example that I gave today, book choices in the library, and a newspaper to tell you about it, is an absolute necessity in a functioning democracy like ours. We have the First Amendment for a reason. The rise of book bans is scary, but look on the bright side. At least our newspapers are able to talk about it, and we the people get to be entitled to our own opinion.